Welcome to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that you'll come back for new episodes after you love this one. And if you are a returning listener or viewer of this podcast, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and of course, insightful. So before we get into the main event and introduce our newest guest, just a reminder for those who are on YouTube, make sure you hit that red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. Also, if you're listening from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or another streaming platform that's audio, make sure you subscribe there as well. And then, of course, for those who want to help us continue to build this awesome platform of Identity Talk, we do accept monetary donations through Cash App and Venmo. So if you're on Cash App, our handle is #IDTALK4ED. And if you are on Venmo, our handle is at KwameSM. That is at symbol KWAMESM. And of course, to catch past episodes of the podcast, you can go to our YouTube channel, which is under my name, Sarfo-Mensah. And you could also go to our official website at identitytalk4educators.com. Thank you kindly. All right, y'all. So we have another guest today, and she is somebody who is literally a baller. So she got some skills on the court, but more importantly, she is all about the DEI work. She is all about equity. She's all about creating equitable spaces for our students in our schools. And she's had an amazing journey just from the research I was doing in preparation for this episode. There's just so much to talk about, but I don't want to spill the beans too early because I want to make sure I give our guests an opportunity to share her story and how she got to where she is today. So without further ado, I want to bring on this proud native of Warren, Ohio. Let's give it up for Dr. Erica Glover. Boom.
Oh, that was
How
an
we
awesome
doing?
interest. That was an awesome interest. Thank you. Awesome introduction. How you doing?
I'm good. How you feeling?
Man, I'm feeling blessed. I'm feeling blessed. I'm feeling great. Um, Today is actually, I know we're recording now and the episode drops later, but today is a day where the Cleveland Browns play the Pittsburgh Steelers. And so I'm super geeked about today outside of just being blessed in the space I'm in.
All right, cool. So y'all about that dog pound,
Oh
huh?
yeah, we about that dog pound. I see you
Come
know a
on
little bit
now.
about it too, so
Get
I
my
appreciate it.
Arsenio. I'm getting my
Yeah,
Arsenio
yeah.
on right now.
Right.
Nah, I actually haven't watched a football game since 2015. So ever since the whole Kaepernick situation, it
Oh, you
just kind
lost
of
it.
changed my perspective on just that industry and everything. So, and I grew up loving the NFL, watching every Sunday and being on my couch for 8-9 hours watching straight football, not doing
Mm,
my chores.
that's
But
respect. I appreciate that perspective. Absolutely, I understand.
yeah. But I do know that Cleveland, hopefully they turn things around.
Thank you.
I know Baker Mayfield ain't there no more. Y'all got a new quarterback and a few new people on the squad, so hopefully they're able to make a run for the playoffs and maybe go further.
Yes. Thank you for the blessings, brother.
Yes, of course. All right, so let's start from the beginnings. Coming from Warren, Ohio, humble beginnings. So tell me a little bit about yourself and how did you ultimately get into the education field?
So I think I truly believe in purpose, right? And I feel like getting into the field of education was like this great intersection of purpose, passion, and roles meeting. And oh, by the way, you get to make a profit out of it, kind of like feeling. My parents, I was raised in a church. So my parents, I went to church 7 days a week, 8 days a week, 378 days a year. And when I was 12 years old, I don't want to say I was forced to, but I definitely was signed up for to be the Sunday school teacher for like 8-year-olds. And so I had to come up with lesson. Now I didn't ask, but I did it. I had to come up with lesson plans and I had to teach the lesson. So my early beginnings of actually teaching, I was teaching Sunday school at 12 years old. Prior to that, I wasn't the type that was playing church or school with the stuffed animals and things of that nature, but I was always the person that ended up babysitting younger cousins. I ended up always, participating in different summer camps, sport camps, and I wasn't even, being paid to go. I just enjoyed it. So a lot of my background, working with family and friends in the community really comes from this dynamic of being able to not just teach, but coach. And so when I transitioned to college and playing basketball, we will oftentimes do small camps. And I didn't feel like it was work. It was just a place to be when I was working with young people. It was my space, my place to be. And so it naturally felt very organic to allow that passion and that purpose to come together. And that's when I decided, I think it was probably about maybe my sophomore year in college. Initially, I thought I was going to be a pediatrician. I mean, I think everybody probably goes through some of these phases. Pediatrician, at one point in time, an attorney, another point in time, a journalist. Maybe my sophomore year. Um, I walked into a conversation with a former teammate who was talking about becoming an intervention specialist. She talked to me about it, and I remember tutoring a cousin who was diagnosed as having a disability. And so that's when I kind of realized that this is actually something I could do, and I love to do. And oh, by the way, I get paid for it. And so that's actually how I ended up in the field of education. And so I ended up, finishing my degree, became an intervention specialist. And what's interesting is the same building that I was hired in full time became the building I became an administrator, and became a coach as well. So I had a lot of different roles. And so when I say when purpose and passion and roles kind of meet, I really truly believe I was entering the space that I was supposed to be in.
Wow. So you mentioned basketball. So before I ask this question, I want to ask a precursor question. What position you play? You sound like you was a point guard. You played the one, didn't you?
Yeah, see how I see if you ask me, right?
Sure.
I feel like I was and this was like who was this person? Allen Iverson, right? I feel like
Yeah, yep.
I was a two guard stuck in a point guard's body. So yes, I did play point guard, but I was coming up around a time when you had Jason Kidd, where you had Gary Payton, you had Penny Hardaway, and those guys were stacking every element of stats, right? So I was trying to be like them, but at the same time, the two guard wanted to ball me too. It was one of those things. So, but yeah, in college I played the point guard, and when they allowed me to, I was trying to play everything else.
All right. Well, listen. Outside of J Kidd, all of them was getting buckets. They
Oh,
they
don't do
definitely was
that
trying to
kid
get buckets.
like that.
No, but I figured you had to play the one because usually the great leaders run the point.
Mm,
They directing everybody, make
yeah,
sure they're in the
yeah.
right positions, making sure that they're calling the right plays on each possession, and that's pretty analogous to what you have to do, not just as a teacher, but even as an administrator.
Yeah.
Every single day, you're making a whole lot of decisions on behalf of thousands of students, on behalf of faculty members, other support staff members.
Mhm.
And, this is all happening in real time. And sometimes some of these are split second decisions. So that's
Absolutely.
where it could be a bit more pressurized. So would love for you to just share what lessons did you gain from the basketball court that you've been able to translate into your career as an educator?
That is probably so. The response to this question is really at the essence of who I've become. Um, I was growing up. I was the only, for a long time, female cousin, uh, younger sister, and so I was out always playing with my guy cousins or my brother. And with that being said, I didn't have the strength, right? I was almost like the underdog, if you will. And there are a lot of things that I learned how to do because I was doing it the wrong way. And as I was coming up as an underdog, still trying to figure out who I was as an athlete, and trying to teach myself, I've realized as I reflect back that I became the coach that wanted to help young people highlight what they brought to the table instead of just pointing to the things that they need to just work on. And I say that because there was a lot of confidence that I had to figure out how to learn and earn. And there were a lot of things I had to figure out in terms of roles, responsibilities, and lanes on the court and even in the space of education. So as a point guard, I had everybody else on the court wanted the ball, right? They wanted the ball, they wanted to score, they wanted to do their thing. And it was, pretty much my job to make sure that we had the balance that we need and that everyone felt comfortable in their lane. Transferring those same skills to, and I'll go with educators or as my position in a minute in terms of being an administrator, it was the same thing, right? You have different teachers that have, that specialize in different content areas, that specialize in specific or really good in specific strategies. And the goal is to try to figure out, okay, how do we learn and work together to appreciate what everyone brings to the table, but at the same time, honoring the gifts that they have, because it is a game of being able, and I don't say game in terms of making it sound or making it look very light, right? But in terms of the balance that is needed to it became one of those things that you wanted to make sure that everyone had the confidence that they needed to do their work and their to bring out their genius and their talents and their abilities. And then even as a coach, I worked with and I was an AAU coach. I did coach girls for a minute, but as an AAU coach, I would have groups of young people, young men actually, that would come to the team, talk like hurt because they didn't have the confidence on their high school teams because their coach was only giving them limited things that they wanted them to do. And so one of the things that I really, and it was really as a result of the experience I had, I wanted to really push for my young men that I work with was, no, we're going to highlight what you do well, but we're also going to, that's that asset-based thinking, right? But we're also
Yeah.
going to work on those things that you can get better at so that we can continue to contribute not just to the team, but to who you are as a basketball player, who you are as a person.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the essence of coaching.
Mm-hmm.
You get your personnel, you see what they're able to do, and you adjust your play calling, your schemes and
Absolutely.
everything to what your players are able to do. You're pretty much tapping into their strengths and playing to those strengths. That's what all the great championship teams do. And it's the same thing, when we're teaching, right? We got to do all the scaffolding, the differentiation for a reason.
Absolutely.
In order for us
Absolutely.
in order for us to do that, we have to know our personnel. We have to know our students, what they can do, what they cannot do. But we're gonna get into that a little bit
Okay.
more. But I do want to backtrack a little bit because before you were Dr. Erica Glover, you was just Erica growing up in Warren, Ohio.
Right.
And I
Right.
want to know, just in your K-12 schooling, were there any struggles, whether they be internal or external, that you had to go through while you're trying to embrace your identity and be your full authentic self?
So that's interesting. That's a really interesting question. More recently, I've really been reflecting on several things, and so what I'll talk about most is the thing that I've been kind of wrestling with more recently is seeing myself and the identity that I was in as an athlete, right? And so, as an athlete, growing up through high school, going up through elementary school, middle school, high school, there were things that came to me as privilege, right? There were times I didn't get in trouble. I should have gotten in trouble, quite honestly, right? And so that identity preceded everything else, quite honestly. And
Mm.
I began to explore that more and more as an older adult, thinking about kind of like where I've come from, and as a result of, right. So I say that that's one thing that I think is important to table for me and my experiences. With that being said, when I came into the classroom, when I became an administrator, there were things that I didn't realize initially in terms of the privilege that I brought to that space, and I began to see Black students as monolithic people because of the privilege I experienced. And so it
Mm.
took some time for me to really understand the privilege that I brought to the table and to look at the different experiences that my scholars were bringing. Now, I'll table that and say that school closure was something that I experienced. And I remember reflecting back on and how it hurt me. I didn't spend a lot of time dwelling on it, but the fact that I still remember it today is something that I think, and I highlight that with educators that I talk to all the time. You know, school
Sure.
closure, there's a loss of identity. If your parents went to that school and graduated from that school, that tradition is now gone, right? There's this piece of now trying to go to a different school across town, fitting in, proving yourself, getting this respect, right? And I don't think that people understand what that does to a young person's social identity. And
Right.
so, and I go back to that privilege as an athlete. One of the things I'm thankful for is that I at least had that. But there were some people who were still trying to find themselves differently. And so they didn't know and trying to figure out, well, who is this authentic self that I can bring to the table? I also experienced open enrollment. And so open enrollment, and it closed on the side of town in Warm at the end of my fifth grade year. And so from second through fifth, I'm going to one elementary school. Sixth grade, on the other side of town where I live. Sixth grade, I go to elementary school on the same side of town that I live. So that in itself is very interesting. So my classroom demographics look different. And so going back to proving yourself, finding your niche, developing a different group of friends, that was something that was not just an internal but an external struggle for me. My best friend and I at the time felt like, you know, we had to be ready to protect ourselves where we needed to. Going into a different neighborhood, navigating was different in terms of those cultures. And so those are some of the things that I kind of dealt with. And then there was also and I talk about this often, especially with the educators that I've worked with in the past. I was the one of the very few Black girls in advanced classes. And so
Mm.
I would go to school and my classroom looked very different than the community I went home to. And I used to wonder, like, why isn't so and so in class with me? How come I don't ever get these classes with, with so and so? And so I started to become friends with folks in my classes, obviously, right? And I remember having a conversation with a couple of my white friends, and I'm telling me, hey, be careful because so and so's parent they're worried that that if they hang around you, they're going to date Black boys. And so there was this like there was there's a lot of different kind of layers and dynamics that were happening at the same time that I was trying to navigate and balance, but quite honestly not disrupt too much because I didn't really even know what it was myself.
Right. And when you look back at your experience, given the work that you do now through Disrupt the University, do you think back to times where you were like, wow, this classmate did some real messed up stuff to me right here? I can't believe I let that slide. I can't believe I let this comment slide. That's wild what this teacher did.
Absolutely. And you know, there is something to be said about like even just how you were raised and how you grew up, right? And so
Sure.
remember I told you I grew up in church, right? And so it was always, quite honestly, making sure that you're humble, listening, not disrupting things too much. So it's ironic that here I am disrupting university. But there are also some things that, and I talk to my parents about this a lot, that not just that they didn't know, but as a result of them not knowing and the result of what I didn't learn in school, I didn't know, right? And so just a history around racism and white supremacy, and even within the curriculum, there's a lot of things that happened in my early years that I wish that I would have been able to know what I know now, to be able
Sure.
to advocate for myself differently, right? And so that's something that I take with me daily. I mean, every single day. And it's really the essence around empowering young people to be advocates for themselves.
Mm. And speaking of your early years, because before you became an administrator, like you mentioned earlier, you were an intervention specialist. So you work with a
Ooh.
lot of students who had maybe different disabilities, students who prior on IEP plans, maybe had 504s. So, and I'm thinking about my own experience having an IEP when I was a kid and how
Mm.
that made me feel, and just the stigma that's associated with that, being a black boy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
In your time as an intervention specialist, like how often did you see a lot of these problematic behaviors from either teachers, maybe even some of your administrators, that ultimately interfered with your ability to intervene and provide the supports you needed to provide for students who are under your load?
So this is probably that question hits probably to the deepest part of my equity journey. It's probably the beginning of my equity journey. And the reason being is because when I went into the classroom as a full-time teacher, I went as a self-contained educator, a self-contained intervention specialist. And so what that meant was all of the students who were in my class were categorized as having, and I say categorized because
Mm-hmm.
after I learned more, it was more or less, in my opinion, lack of relationships that were established. So my young people were categorized as having an emotional disturbance. And so I'll never forget, I'm going, and the teacher that was in the classroom that I took over left the classroom before the end of the meeting. There were like two or three other teachers that had come before me. And so the coordinator introduced me to the class my first day. And as she was walking out, the last thing she said to me was, Erica, it's important that you just make relationships first, right? And so I really didn't understand that at the time, because I felt like that naturally just happened for me. I'm teaching and I have kids or scholars in my classroom from grades 9 through 12. And my job is to teach them their specific content at their grade level, all in one class. Policy issue number one, right? Like if you think about a 12th grader who's reading at a fifth grade level, he doesn't want his peers to know what's going on with him. And so now I'm
Mm-hmm.
having to teach this scholar at his level in front of peers. Now, and outside of that, which is, not a problem at all, but I'm thinking about how all of these dynamics are coming together. Outside of that, I was reflecting on the situation. And so at the time, we were waiting on our new building, and the building that I was in, the classroom, they called it a dungeon. The heat didn't work in the winter, and the air didn't work in the summer. And so there are often times where, my students will have to wear coats in the classroom. And I'll never forget the time we were having a conversation. Our first thing that we used to do in the morning was just check in with each other. And so before SEL and checking in became, um, unfortunately, something that people just do, this is kind of like what we did to take care of each other as a community in the classroom. And I had a epiphany at that moment. And I'm like, hey, where's the only other place that you are in one classroom the entire day, and they tell you when you can use the restroom, they tell you when you can go to recess, and they tell you when you can eat lunch? And one of my students, I'll never forget, like screamed out jail. And it was like at that moment, I was like, I cannot practice or prepare you for a school to prison pipeline. Like it's not okay
Right.
for you to be in one classroom all day. And for a while, my students were institutionalized, right? They believed that they belonged in that classroom. They didn't even want to go out into the general classroom. It was that moment in that conversation that they began to feel like, you know what? We have to prove to everyone else outside of this classroom that not only do we belong in these spaces, but we are just as intelligent as they are. And so it really changed the approach that I had working with scholars from that point on. That's when I really realized not just understanding inequities, but how to help scholars advocate for themselves and empower them to be able to not just speak their voice, but uplift their voice in ways that are most supportive of them. And so that equity journey is probably one of the most, I talk about it all the time. It was the most impactful thing I've learned about. And I didn't even go look at my scholars' records. I purposely didn't look at, didn't do that. But when I did, I would go back and be like, wow, they put you in a self contained unit for that. And so the policy, even around referrals to an emotional disturbed classroom or having an IEP that reads emotional disturbed, like, or the testing that is required that says you are gifted or not, right? Like, or who even defines gifted? All really speaks to, in my opinion, just the lack of perspective that we have around those spaces.
Yeah, and even with the labels, that's what leads to
Right.
just tracking.
Exactly.
And usually
Exactly.
the tracking is very much racialized too.
Absolutely, absolutely,
With
and right, and we talk about that, right? The over and the underrepresent, like, and not underrepresentation, but the overpopulation of a certain group or demographics of individuals in special ed in certain categories or labels, and then the lack of opportunities for advanced classes for
mhm.
gifted, if you will, where we should have gifted opportunities embedded in the curriculum and in the classroom, generally speaking, across the spectrum of learners.
Absolutely. And then when you're mentioning about your self-contained class, I'm thinking to myself, hold up, they're not even following the whole least restrictive environment policy right there, because how much time are they spending in the mainstream classes with their other peers in the same grades? I'm wondering that, given what
Right,
you've described to me.
right. And so, and and that's a great point. And one of the things that I realized was how, for lack of better words, shifty uh, things would be with men, least restrictive or not, right? Like, all right, we're going into the cafeteria. Those are minutes that counts. And so when you ask the question about right, when you ask the question about administration, I was blessed enough to have an administrator who was like, "Hey, Erica, do whatever you want." You know,
There you go.
I came to her and I was like, "Hey, my scholars want to go out in the general ed population. That's what we're going to do. I'll go with them, but we're going to do that." And she was very empowering, and she let us kind of do what we wanted. And so our goal, it was interesting because we would have middle school scholars come in from eighth grade, thinking that they were going to finish and graduate their lifetime as scholars in the self-contained unit, and they come in freshman year. We like, yeah, nah, that's not about to happen here. You about to go out in the class, and it took some time because they were so institutionalized. They thought that they only deserved to be in one space.
Mhm. And there should be a whole episode on just the way special education operates, because there's
Yeah.
so many shady things that happen,
Yes.
even with the diagnosis piece.
Yes. Yes. And
I've been in many.
on
Yeah,
top of that, Kwame, it's even yes, we give parents their rights, and you know what I'm saying, but who's unpacking that for them, right?
they don't
And
know them.
so, and that, and
They
so
don't know them.
that really does speak to a lot of, that's a whole nother episode. Like, I advocated for my parents, whereas there were times where maybe a district wanted me to say this. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. And so you get to a point where you're looking yourself in the mirror, and it's which you are not going to do as a result of who you are.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. And I know before we started recording, off air, we were talking about you were talking about your experience in your doctoral program,
Mm,
about writing your dissertation and how you had to use all this fancy, sophisticated academic language to explain simple points.
yeah.
And I'm thinking about, the IEPs
Mm,
that we present to parents during those meetings, and we're talking about minutes. He's going to get this intervention for 40 minutes times 3 periods. Like they're supposed to know. Listen, I don't even know half the stuff, and I've been teaching for over 10 years. So, how do we expect parents to understand what you're talking about? We don't even take the time to break it down. At least the people that I've come across, they don't really do that.
right.
Nor do we give parents the grace and the space to just, process what's going on. And I don't even know how many parents came to those meetings with advocates who can translate this very dense, ambiguously written language for them, right? So there's a lot there, between that and then also how we diagnose students. The fact that
Yeah.
you don't know what diagnosis there is, so you just say, okay, they have a specific learning disability, an SLD. That's like a catch-all, basically. Like, I can't think of what that is. We're just gonna put an SLD there so we can get them through the testing protocol and then place them in a different class. Like it's really lazy.
Is and I mean, and there's a whole lot to be said about how individualized are IEPs, right?
Sure.
Especially if you're thinking about that catch-all category, that catch-all label. And what's on the flip end, we talk often, well, more, I guess, more recently, personalized learning. Well,
Mm-hmm.
IEPs intention where that the notion of what they are, that it should be in the personalized support, personalized interventions, right?
Sure.
And quite honestly, the resources in urban settings aren't there for that. And the supports that are needed aren't there for that. And the background around that space is, I don't think people really understand that there are limited experiences across different districts with that background in that space as well.
Yeah, for sure. So we're talking about a lot of different issues with special education, a lot of which you experience in your own journey, being an intervention specialist. So, like, how much of a factor did all those experiences play into you making a transition into principalship and other leadership opportunities?
So my colleague and I, we used to be co-teachers in the same classroom, and it wasn't expected, quite honestly, for us to have such an impact on our on those particular cohorts of students in the self-contained unit. And we knew we were doing something right when we would have students from general ed classrooms walking by like, hey, we keep hearing about your class, we want to, hey, how we get in your class? And it was like tough for us to respond to that, because we didn't want to put our scholars out there, but at the same time we wanted to acknowledge what they were really communicating to us. And so um, I do a lot in the community. My colleague and I, we do a lot of PBL type of experiences, working with local universities, and pre-service teachers. And one of the things that we do is that we want to make sure that we are reaching as many students outside of our spaces that we can. And so when I decided to go into education, I mean, into leadership, that's really what it was. It was me being able to take the opportunities that I had to be able to get to know students differently. And so I went from having a small classroom size in a self contained unit, to being able to developed different relationships as a result of transitioning into leadership. And that was just that was probably like how do I describe it? That was like icing on a cake. I really began to understand as a result of our discipline data, as a result of attendance, as a result of all of this data that was presented out to us during our team meetings, and the strategies that I used, that I was in a position to impact that data differently. And so when I was asked to consider, going into a role as administrator, I began to realize that as a leader in the building, that I could impact that data differently. And so that was another reason why I decided to go into educational leadership, to reduce or to eliminate the disparities, the racial disparities and the inequities that our young people are facing. And then being able to work with my colleagues that way, I felt as if that there were strategies in terms of building relationships. And we talk about this all the time. There's a difference between default relationship, a relationship that I earn as a result of you coming into my classroom, versus authentic relationships. And as a self-contained teacher who has students with emotional disturbances or categorized that way, there was we had the 10-day OSS with the manifestation determination, right? We looked at that differently. We looked at it in terms of, okay, what relationships do we need to not even get to that point?
Mm-hmm.
And so those are strategies that I realized that I had, that a lot of my colleagues, in my opinion, would benefit from. And so that step into educational leadership was really easy for me, because I was looking at the gaps, and I was trying to find my space in that role. It's like being a point guard, right? It's like, all right, we're struggling here, so I'm a pick up this, and I'm gonna do this here, so that our
Right.
team can do what we need to do.
I hear that. I hear that. And then on top of transitioning to education leadership, eventually you had the idea to start Disrupt the University
Yeah.
and really get deeper into this equity work. So talk to me about how you got the inspiration to start Disrupt the University, and what's the ultimate mission of the work you do through that company?
So my research is centered around Black teacher identity. And so I was really looking to understand the experiences, both as Black teachers while they were adolescents, their schooling experiences, and then their personal and professional experiences that speaks to the strategies that they use to support students in urban settings. And so from that research, there were different things, right? Different strategies that came to light. And one of the most frequently used words throughout that research was disruptor. And so whether it be through curriculum, right? Whether it be non-academic strategies that some of those educators labeled as life skills, or navigating global experiences and awareness, whether it's critical thinking, critical consciousness. A lot of those Black educators really were able to speak to things that they were doing that they didn't necessarily learn in teacher prep courses, that happened as a result of the experiences they had as young people and working through oppressive institutional structures. And so Disrupting University really comes from the experiences that I heard about throughout the research that I've been doing. And I kind of speak to that in terms of what I experienced, right? School closure, open enrollment, that ends up being closed enrollment, for lack of better words. Moving from one side of the city to another, and you think about the policies, desegregation, how those things impact even how Black educators are situated in a specific space of education. And so in an area or a field where the perspectives that come out of the research is predominantly white, my goal was to really kind of focus in on the experiences of Black educators. And so Disruptor University comes from that. And so at the end of the day, Disruptor University is an organization that really works to disrupt the socialization pattern of teachers that limits us in terms of understanding the importance of cultural awareness, and the importance of critical consciousness. And so when we think about who our future whatever is going to be, our future educators, our future lawyers, police officers, nurses, doctors, whoever, in order for us to develop and support young people who are thinking about global awareness and cultural awareness, we have to disrupt the patterns that have already the status quo, the traditions that are in place that doesn't allow us to see people in ways that allows them to embrace their authentic self in those spaces. And so we are looking at how do we work with scholars that way? How do we work with pre-service teachers that way? And then how do we work with school districts that way so that cycle is interrupted?
And no, that's real powerful because I know for a lot of pre-service teachers, particularly those that got their training in the early 2000s, even late 2000s, early 2010s, which is when I was doing my training for my master's program, we weren't getting this information.
Right.
We're just going through the motions and just trying to get our degree and our license just to get in the classroom. But I know when you dive into this equity work, it always starts internally. You do the readings, you do the research, you start to look at the errors of your ways,
Yep.
and then once you come to that awakening, you start to then see things a lot differently, especially when you walk into different school districts, different classrooms. So in the work that you do through Disrupt the University, I know y'all have an acronym called DIVE, which I would love for you to talk a little bit more about because I feel like it's something that we all must adopt as far as a mindset goes when doing this work. So tell us off, what does the acronym DIVE stand for our listeners and viewers?
Yeah. So DIE stands for disrupting inequities within varying experiences. And so when I worked for this particular school district where I was a DEI learning specialist, one of the things that we really focused in on was we've all experienced both advantages and disadvantages. We've all experienced needing support, wanting support. We've all experienced having barriers, either removed or not, right? We've all experienced disappointment, frustration at different levels and not necessarily had the language to attach to it. And so when we talk about die, we're talking about how do we embrace folks so in the way that they want to be their authentic self? How do we create not just safe spaces, but brave spaces so that people can question the status quo in a way that is the betterment for not just everyone in this space, but for the organization, generally speaking. And so we oftentimes talked about being seen, valued, and heard, and it's not just something you say. In order to really truly understand at the individual level, being seen, valued, and heard, you have personalized experiences. And you have to first be able to reflect on self to understand, well, what are my experiences that I've had where I felt those emotions that I'm very much connected to? And at the same time, what experiences don't I understand because I've never had them? And I think we oftentimes dismiss that latter, just because it's easier to not think about what you've not experienced. And so we really emphasize students as scholars as their own experts of their experience. And how do I learn from the expert of their experience? How do I dive into understanding the social political context that they're coming from? How do I enhance my own critical consciousness so that I'm not just reflecting on my experiences and then pushing my experiences on others, but I'm also now thinking about how different people come to this space differently as a result of who they are.
Mm. And speaking on people being in different places on this journey of equity, you've been in a lot of schools. You've come across a lot of different faculty and staff members in those schools. Not everybody's on that same plane when it comes to equity and their capacity around that. So I'm wondering, how are you able to push teachers to dive, pun intended, into this work and engage in this reflection that you're speaking of?
So I think one of the things that we emphasize, or we used to emphasize, and I say that because I currently as a consultant, I just do the work myself, right? But in the
Mhm.
districts that I've supported is, first of all, what is our common language around equity? Um, when you're talking about diving, you folks need to know what they're diving into, right? What
Sure.
is equity? How do I understand it? How have I experienced inequity? Or how do I know about the experiences of others as a result in inequities that they may have experienced? So first, we really spend time, and I kind of mentioned this before, understanding who you are, right? And in terms of people coming in at different spaces, is what are the experiences that you had in your experiences as a former scholar? What were those great experiences? What are those experiences that you wish would have gone differently? What was that? What did that teacher do? That educator do that brought you to education, and what was the one that kind of pushed you away, right? And so once you begin to think about the experiences you've had, and you make connections to the emotions that you felt, now you're in a position to understand how things could be different for other people. And we start at I think it's important to start at a very foundational level. I also think it's important to show the data around equities. I think and I can't remember his name off the top of my head. There's one thing to talk about facts, there's another thing to speak to data. And
Mhm.
so we also point to the racial disparities. And it's like, okay, if we know this isn't working for this particular group of young people, and as educators, our job is to reflect and adjust, what are we going to do differently? Right. And so we begin to unpack even those strategies, the deficit mindset that comes with that, right? Being or and pivoting towards more of an asset-based mindset in terms of how we're working with our young people. And another thing that we work through is we think it's important is the history behind systemic racism. There are so many times where I'm presenting and I'm consulting with folks, and we're talking about the timeline of different policies that have led up to where we are in this space of not just education but our world today. And there's so many times I hear people say, hear people say, oh my God, I didn't know. And so, part of the work of diving, part of working with people that's coming in from different perspectives is finding different, just like in the classroom. I have different students that come in from different angles of learning experiences. My job is to be able to make sure that I'm understanding where they're at, and I'm giving that content so that they're making connections to not just first their experiences and then how it relates to others. And so that's why the book that I was talking to you about, Kwame, is so important. It's like, in order to be more culturally aware, you have to first be emotionally. You have to think about who you are emotionally. That emotional intelligence is very important, right? And oftentimes you hear educators talk about SEL, transformative SEL is where I pivot to. How do you model SEL if you are still working through your own emotional intelligence? And so we start at that foundational level of who are you? Why are you here as an educator? What form your beliefs? What speaks to the pedagogy and the approaches that you're choosing? And then how do we pivot so that it is aligned to the differences, the genius, the uniqueness that your scholars bring?
All right. And I know that Dr. Dina Simmons talks a lot about social emotional learning. Um,
Absolutely.
and shout out to Dr. Dina Simmons. If you're hearing this, I'd love for you to come on this podcast. Quick plug there.
Absolutely.
Um,
Transformative SEL.
yeah, because she talks a lot about how schools present SEL as white supremacy with a hug,
Yep.
where, okay, we're going to keep it cute. We're going to talk about feelings and emotions, but we're not going to intersect it with the racialized experiences of historically marginalized folks. We're not going to intersect how different students feel with what's happening in their neighborhoods, what's happening in their homes.
And that's why one of the things that I think is most important is helping folks understand first what are the differences that speaks to the worldview views and the perspective that's people bring to the table, right? And then outside of these differences, in the context in which they're coming from, what are what are those social political influences that impact their lives that will now impact how they show up in your classroom. And critical consciousness sometimes is a struggle for people at the early point of this journey, right? And so it's really bringing to light those experiences that our scholars are navigating through, and not just, I mean, and not just highlighting resilience, but the inequities that comes with having to be resilient, you know?
For sure. And then I have one last question before our lightning round. And this is going back to just the self work.
Okay.
So even though you talk a lot about equity and you are in different schools and different communities preaching and just sharing the importance of this work, you yourself aren't an expert in what you're sharing. You're still learning as this is going on. I think there's a humility that comes with it. It's a critical humility that comes with the work that we do in equity. So I would love for you to just share how you're continuing to grow in your own practice and what are some blind spots that you're still growing in your understanding of diversity and equity and inclusion.
I think that I think it's always I'm a lifelong learner. I'm gonna begin with that first of
Yes.
all. And if I'm in a
Mhm.
space of education, there's no way that I can say I'm an educator and not be a lifelong learner at the same time. With that being said, I believe that there are people that have different levels of understanding in this work, but there is no way that anyone is going to get to a point of perfection in his work because society changes so fast, culture changes so fast. And so part of my way of my goal in terms of ensuring that I am practicing this lifelong learning journey is research, is to be in those spaces that are different and understanding the discomfort that might come with existing in spaces that are different, that I've never been in, that I don't understand, and questioning and interrogating the thoughts that come to mind as a result of being in an uncomfortable space. I think that is probably one of the most humbling experience that I've had, and it gives me an understanding of what else I need to learn. There are different dimensions of diversity that are coming to this space with, that are being named, that I think that especially if you haven't had those experiences, right? Then you just wouldn't know. And like more recently, we're having conversations around neurodiversity. And I have scholars who wants to have those conversations and talk about, that, even that dimension of diversity. And so being able to have conversations like, you know what, I don't know every aspect of this, right? But I'm going to find out as much as I can. I think there's time to have conversations and ask questions in this area, but there is something that I believe is important, regardless of where you're at in your level in this work, is you still need to put in that time to research and learn and understand for yourself.
Yeah, neurodiversity is an area that I am still growing in a lot
Hmm.
more. And I'm even thinking
Hmm.
back to my own experience as a student with an IEP. The
Hmm.
fact that even to this day, as I approach my 40s, I'm still a slow processor.
Yep. That's me
But
too.
I
That is
but
me
I got two
too.
college degrees though. I got two
Right,
college degrees.
right.
So
I tell, like, my friends know when they ask me a question to give me a second, because I've learned over time that's what I need. Whereas if you're in a classroom, you ask a question, when put your hand up. What if I haven't gotten here, but I know the answer to that question, right? And so, like, just even understanding and becoming better at understanding the ways that our brains operate, I think is important.
right. And even when we think about neurodiversity, it's not even just about how we differentiate content and even the pedagogical approaches that we take. It's also about the pacing.
Yeah.
Like, because a lot of the pacing is accelerated because we're spending so much time trying to get to the assessments
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
as
Yeah.
opposed to taking our time and seeing where people are, because we can't do a one size fits all approach when it comes to this, because we're all coming at different rates in terms of how we process information. It just doesn't work that way, but that's how our schools and even our curriculum is structured and even packaged. We look at scope and sequence plans. They say, all right, you should be done with this in 2 days, 3 days. But guess what? I have a class that has IEPs, has students with IEPs. I have students who are emerging bilinguals. They need time to process
Right.
this language as they learn English. I have students who don't have an IEP, but probably should have an IEP, and I still got
Mm-hmm.
to break down this work for them.
Mm-hmm. I
And
have
it's just,
students that need
yeah,
to have hands-on experiences versus paper and pencil, right?
come
And
on.
not even giving that experience to them that way as well. And I think this education, we really do a good job of saying what we should be doing. Like we will espouse, like we'll say, oh, we're lifelong learners. Oh, we're preparing global learnings, or we personalize learning. We do a really good job of saying it, but what that looks like in practice, I feel like that's where a large part of that disconnect is.
Oh, big facts right there. But listen, Dr. Erica Glover, this has been an awesome conversation.
Yes, yes, I
And
appreciate it.
we gonna wrap this up with this lightning round. So I have a few fun
All right,
questions to ask you. Um, First off, how you taking care of yourself? What's your self-care routine these days?
I'm on the beach. I'm trying to figure out how to get on the beach at all times. That's my self care. I am in a different space mentally on the beach, eyes closed, listening to a podcast, listening to an audible, or if I can't get to a beach as quickly as I can, I'm reading a book. Those are definitely, and it's been different over time, but that's definitely where I am with my self care.
All right, cool. What current book are you reading?
Your Purpose is Calling. It just dropped September 20th by Dr. Darius Daniels. He really explores identity from a biblical perspective. And so is super dope. Like it's one of the I read Purpose Driven Life years and years ago. This book right here tops that hands
All
down for
right,
me.
cool.
So I definitely encourage anyone that's listening to grab that book.
All right. Give me your top five favorite basketball players.
Oh, that's easy. I'm going with Brian, MJ, Kobe, Tamika Catchings, and
Oh,
man, I played against her, and I'm like, oh yeah, she,
oh, when
she
she
know.
was in Tennessee.
Yeah, I played against her when she's in Tennessee, and then I played in the NWBL. She played for a team that I played against in the NWBL. So yeah, and then Gary Payton,
The glove.
the
Yeah.
glove. So I'm Erica Glover, so it was like only right,
Ah, cool, cool, cool. And then my last question is, who would you like to see on this podcast?
Oh, I got a friend named Kenny JoJo Smith. He actually is a children's book author. He actually works with me at Disrupt University. He's really been focusing on a Black male perspective in education. I really think that you guys would connect. And I got one more I'm throwing out there.
Go
Chris
ahead.
Edmean. I'm sorry, I got to throw him out there. Ratchet
Oh,
Demics.
Dr. Emden. Oh yeah,
Man, you
that's
got Emden. Yes, you got to get him on here talking about Ratchet Demics. That book.
yeah. Listen, shout out to Dr. Emden. Shout out to Hip Hop Ed. I've actually have reached out to him, a couple occasions, but the man's busy. But I'm
Yeah,
gonna
yeah,
still
I know.
continue to reach out to him. His books have really
Fire.
changed my perspective, and I still refer to him to this day. He's just a north star for me.
Yeah, he is. His everything he writes is fire,
Yeah,
and it embodies all of kind of quite honestly who I come to the table with as an educator.
yeah, for sure. All right, and then of course we can't let you go without sharing with the good listeners and viewers how they can connect with you on social media, and also drop the Disrupt That University website for folks to visit.
Yes, absolutely. So you can catch me on Instagram, Twitter at Dr. Erica Glover. That's DRERICA GLOVER. It is exactly how it sounds. You can also connect with us, reach out in terms of what we do with Disruptor University at www.disruptoruniversity. And then make sure you have the E for disruptor, disruptoruniversity.com.
All right, y'all heard it. Make sure y'all check out Disrupt the University, learn about their services. They're doing some dope work. All right, Dr. Glover, it's been real.
It's been an
Appreciate you for
honor.
giving
Thank
us
you.
this hour. Yes, same here. Likewise. Thank you so much. And I wish you a good rest of the day.
Likewise, brother. Thank you.
All
Peace.
right. Thank you. Peace. All right, y'all. Well, we had a great time with Dr. Erica Glover. Hopefully, y'all continue to follow her and the work of Disrupt University on social media and beyond. But as for us, we're about to end our time together. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, y'all.